Welcome everyone to Racial Justice and Equity, Pathways to Peace. My name is Neda Samanpour. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Global Peace and Prosperity Forum, the organization hosting this event aimed at facilitating reflection and finding solutions to the realization of racial justice and equity. If we are to achieve racial justice and equity, we must eliminate all factors that hamper our collective unity. For justice is the ruling principle of social organization if humanity is to achieve unity and peace. Justice is the awareness that in the achievement of human progress, the interests of the individual and those of society are inextricably linked. A concern for justice is therefore the indispensable compass in the collective life of society, because it's the only means by which unity of thought and action can be achieved. Discriminatory or abusive behavior, such as racism and intolerance towards people because of their imagined inferiority, has been devastating to humanity. It has justified slavery, colonialism, apartheid, forced sterilization, and annihilations of people. These historic injustices have stained the pages of human history. Many of these injustices were rooted in prejudice and belief that there are human races within the human species distinguishable on the basis of physical differences. Today, we are fortunate to have the knowledge and understanding due to science that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated biologically distinct groups, and that race is an imagined entity or social construct. All human beings belong to the same species, and therefore it makes no sense to talk of races. And yet, despite this profound truth that there is no superior race with an inherent right to exercise power over those considered inferior, and despite the acknowledgement that the right to be protected from racism and racial discrimination is first and foremost a fundamental right of all human beings, racism rooted in prejudice continues to impact our societies, and its effects lingers on, taking on different forms, resulting in violence as well as social, economic, and political inequalities. Combating racism and intolerance has been at the heart of the United Nations and the Council of Europe through their various conventions and mechanisms. The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, set up by the Council of Europe, has made major contributions in helping people understand racism and racial discrimination are changing concepts and now encompass acts targeting persons or groups, not only because of their race, color, or ethnic origin, but also because of their language, religion, or nationality, and that the main prerequisite for effectively combating racism and racial discrimination is recognizing that these problems exist. Dismantling systemic racism and working to repair centuries of harm inflicted on communities of color has recently taken center stage in public discourse across the globe, sparked by the graphic images in social media of the death of George Floyd in 2020. The global protest Black Lives Matter following the killing of George Floyd demonstrated that we have yet to eliminate racial prejudice, not only within the United States, but that countering racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance and tackling racial inequality are challenges faced by every state. The outcry for racial justice has raised calls to educate, inform, and demand change in justice systems, communities, workplaces, and social circles. As Nelson Mandela urged in his 1994 address to the General Assembly, racism degrades both the perpetrator and the victim. If we are to remain true to our commitment to protect human dignity, then we must ensure justice for all, for we are in essence one human race, one human family, and we must learn to reflect our oneness and common humanity in both deeds and words. I am truly honored and delighted that we are joined today by a distinguished panel who will share their valuable insights on this very important topic, and I can't wait to hear the deliberations. Professor Payam Achavan, who will be moderating the panel discussion, is Senior Fellow at Massey College, Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. He was previously full professor at McGill University Faculty of Law, with prior appointments at other universities, including Yale Law School and Oxford University. He has published extensively on international criminal law, and in 2017, he delivered the CBC Massey Lectures in Search of a Better World, which became the best-selling nonfiction book in Canada. Payan, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neda, for that kind introduction. And thank you, dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today for this exceptional panel. And I'm very honored to be able to chair among such distinguished panelists. We will be beginning with brief interventions by each of our panelists, after which I hope that we will be able to have a robust conversation. And I would, of course, encourage all of you in the audience to submit your questions on the chat function. And we will try and address as many of them as possible. Without further ado, I will begin by introducing our first distinguished panelist, Ambassador Fatima Kiari Mohammed, who is the permanent observer of the African Union to the United Nations. Her mandate is to represent the AU at the UN and to develop and maintain a constructive and productive relationship between the AU and its member states in New York. Prior to her appointment, she was Senior Special Advisor to the ECOWAS Commission, and her career spans over 2 decades with a focus on peace, security, socioeconomic development, regional integration, organizational development, and project management, both in the public and private sectors. Ambassador, we're honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and greetings to everyone. And let me start by thanking you for this invitation and commending Ms. Nida Salampur and the Global Peace and Prosperity Forum for organizing this discussion on such a very important topic, I think, which should be a priority for all of us. I'm honored to also share with you some perspectives, particularly from the African Union, and I will try and touch upon, some of the broader, I think, issues from a global perspective. First of all, let me start by saying that the issue of racial justice and equity is one of fundamental importance for us, as many parallels can be drawn between the history of African states under colonial rule and apartheid, and the current struggles of people of African descent and people of color in general in many regions around the world, where our brothers and sisters continue to fight for justice, for peace and equity, and their basic human rights. Globally speaking, the international community, and more specifically the UN, our global institution, has made efforts towards combating racism and racial discrimination from its inception in 1945, and this is declared in the preamble of its charter on the question of human rights, and in the adoption of the United Nations declarations, a number of them, decisions and conventions, and of course the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which recognizes that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. From the regional African level, the AU at its inception as the then Organization of African Unity played a determinant role and an instrumental part in the liberation of African states and the continent as a whole, and the process of attainment of unity for us as a people. And it has also provided a unique framework for collective action to fight against all forms of racial inequalities. The organization is also determined to promote and protect human and people's rights and consolidate democratic institutions and culture and ensure good governance and the rule of law as provided in the preamble of the AU Charter. Now, in terms of globally or regionally speaking, the policies and frameworks do exist. But as a global community, we have not been able to attain the vision of our founders as countless human beings, as it was well articulated in the introduction, continue to be victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms that are related to intolerance in the world. And, you know, we have to question why this is. If you see it on paper, you feel that, you know, this world should be a perfect world. But unfortunately, every day we continue to see all sorts of conflict that are stemming, you know, from different historical reasons. And I think generally it comes down to the issue of the universal adherence to domestication and implementation, right? So for example, with the International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, the convention itself was adopted and opened for signature by the UN General Assembly in 1965, and it entered into force a few years later in 1969. And as at last year, 2020, it has 88 signatories and 182 parties. And many countries have expressed declarations and reservations, which they have the right to do, as we do not necessarily have, you know, need to have one definition, but there needs to be some sort of global framework or understanding that allows us for adaptation depending on the country or regional context. But that said, I think it's important that there should not be one set of rules for some and a different for others, depending on the context. And having this global understanding means we need to agree to the paramount importance for promoting equality and non-discrimination in the world. The other issue, I think, is the general, lack of political will, weak legislation, the lack of implementation of strategies and concrete actions by states, as well as just the prevalence and the nurturing, in some cases, of racist attitudes and negative stereotyping. And I think as a global community, we have a responsibility to promote the universal respect for and the observance and protection of all human rights, economic, social, cultural rights, civil and political rights, and fight racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, and all sorts of related intolerance. We need to look at ways in which our governments can take some decisive steps. And I think one way is to look into institutional reforms of our systems, for example, to ensure that some of the historical injustices that exist are not repeated in many country contexts. And this refers to both organizations, but also, countries and societal contexts as well, right? Because discrimination is not only racial, in some cases or contexts, it's tribal, it's religious, and so on and so forth. We also need to find ways to ensure that in the context of this we need to find ways of, having kind of like zero tolerance policies, and within that context, look at, allegations of racism or discrimination, and ensure that these are addressed within our various institutions. In terms of the African Union itself, I think as a whole, as an institution, one of the things that we have tried to do to promote inclusion in terms of the institution as a whole is to find ways of ensuring that our African diaspora as a whole is integrated somehow into our initiatives. And the African diaspora is actually recognized as a sixth region of the African continent. And we have a number of platforms where we've tried to integrate the thinking of our diaspora outside of the continent. Let me just conclude by saying there's so much that we can learn from each other in terms of history, what we should do and what we should avoid doing, given that this has not really paid off in a balanced manner. And we need to look at issues of such as transitional justice, learning from other experiences, looking at intergenerational discussions, for example, and the realities that some of, particularly our younger generations, are facing today, and also look at what we can learn from many who were part of the struggle for independence, whether it was independence from slavery or colonization, the struggles of the 50s and the 60s, for example, in Africa, where many countries were fighting for independence. And then we need to look at the possibility of having interregional discussions across all regions, be it Africa, within the various geographical regions, because there are a lot of similarities and parallels that we can draw from our experiences, and then use these platforms to keep educating and sensitizing and advocating for equality. So maybe I'll just stop there, given the time restrictions, and I'm happy to pick up on a couple of the other points at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your very eloquent and concise presentation, and especially for the many thought-provoking suggestions and recommendations that I hope we will be able to discuss further in the question and answer period. I'm now going to move on to our second panelist, the Right Honourable the Baroness Scotland of Atholl, who unfortunately is not able to join us in person, but who has prepared a pre-recorded video message. And I will nonetheless introduce her so the audience is better acquainted with her biography. Baroness Scotland is the Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations. She trained as a barrister and was appointed Queen's Counsel in 1991 in the UK, and she became at age 35 the youngest woman ever to be made a QC. Baroness Scotland joined the House of Lords in 1997 and went on to serve as a minister in the Foreign Office, Home Office, and the Lord Chancellor's Department within the UK government. In 2007, Baroness Scotland was appointed Attorney General for England and Wales, the first woman to hold the post since it was created in 1315. She was elected as Secretary General at the 2015 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting and took office in April of 2016. And Baroness Scotland is the second Secretary General from the Caribbean, from Dominica, and the first woman to hold the post. So I would now ask that her video intervention be shown.
Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity of addressing you and to acknowledge all distinguished delegates, but particularly Your Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, my dear sister, and Professor Maria Daniela Maruda, Chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, Council of Europe. In offering some thoughts as you commence your discussion on racial justice as a pathway to peace, I reflect on the significant contributions made by the Commonwealth collectively from the trenchant fight against apartheid in the 1960s through the decades until today, where we have been in the vanguard of the fight for racial justice. In the Lusaka Declaration on Racism and Racial Prejudice, agreed at the 1979 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Zambia, our leaders unequivocally rejected as inhuman and intolerable all policies designed to perpetuate apartheid, racial segregation, or other policies based on theories that racial groups are or may be inherently superior or inferior. More than 40 years on, having witnessed on television and mobile devices distressing video images of the callous murder of George Floyd, it is necessary to reaffirm our collective rejection of the evils of racism, racial segregation, and bigotry. Young people across the world were so aggrieved by the savagery that they braved the dangers of a global pandemic to protest against the scourge of racism and proclaim no justice, no peace. 60% of the combined Commonwealth population of 2.4 billion people in our 54 member countries are under the age of 30. With them and for them and through them, we continually renew our work to develop ever greater respect and understanding and to celebrate diversity with inclusive and equal rights for all citizens. We unequivocally recommit to working in practical ways to eradicate the pernicious scourges of racism and racial prejudice through the new conceptions by which the Commonwealth we are able to bring the touches of healing and reconciliation and to build in positive ways to deliver a common future and to overcome negative legacies of inheritances from the past. Through the Commonwealth Charter, our member nations have committed themselves to equality and respect for all, without discrimination on any grounds, as being the foundations of peaceful, just, and stable societies, noting that these rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, and cannot be implemented selectively. Our Charter goes on to declare the implacable opposition of our member nations to all forms of discrimination, whether rooted in gender, race, colour, creed, political belief, or other grounds. Our practical Commonwealth approach to upholding these and our other commitments emphasises dialogue, consensus, and mutual support as means for realising our vision for a common future based on justice, equality, and non-discrimination. The 1.44 billion young people living, working, and playing in Commonwealth countries are making immensely valuable and crucial contributions in the fight against racism, xenophobia, prejudice, and related intolerance, particularly through their use of social media and the internet. So we need to be aware that these platforms have also become the preferred method of communication by the purveyors of hatred and misinformation. At a time when there is much necessary physical isolation because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to protect the potential of online connection as a means for positive and constructive engagement and discussion, while preventing malicious and negative influences and ideologies it is incumbent upon us all to also protect peaceful, open dialogue with freedom of expression and the free flow of information. As it did in 1979, the Commonwealth continues to recognise the importance of the contribution the media can make to human rights and the eradication of racism and racial prejudice by helping to eliminate ignorance and misunderstanding between people and by drawing attention to the evils which afflict humanity. Today, we again affirm the importance of truthful presentation of facts in order to ensure that the public are fully informed of the dangers presented by racism and racial prejudice. We remain committed to working in these ways, including collaboratively with other multilateral organisations, governments and civil society to deliver on our Commonwealth aspiration for a common future. I trust your deliberations will be fruitful and look forward to continuing engagement with you on this immensely important priority for Commonwealth cooperation.
I wanted to note that Baroness Scotland's message was recorded, in fact, before we had finalized all of the members of the panel. So if there were certain omissions, it had to do with the timing of that video recording. So following this yet other very elegant presentation, it is my pleasure now to introduce our next panelist. But before doing so, I wanted to note that the Honorable Dr. Bernard from the Senate of Canada is unfortunately unable to join us because she was detained on urgent parliamentary matters. So we will go straight on to our next outstanding speaker, Professor Maria Daniela Maruda, who's chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe. She's assistant professor in international law at the Pantheon University of Athens and Jean Monnet chairholder on EU solidarity in civil protection and humanitarian action, and also a member of the Comité pour le concours Jean Pictet since 2003. Professor Maruda is also alternate director of the European Training and Research Center on Human Rights and Humanitarian Action at Pantheon University of Social and Political Studies since 2000, consultant on international humanitarian law at the Hellenic Red Cross, and she has 15 years of experience in humanitarian fieldwork through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, including in armed conflicts in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1996, Albania in 1997, Kosovo in 1999, Sri Lanka in 1998 to 99, and then onwards based in Greece with short missions in areas in crisis or conflict. Professor Maruda, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Akavan. Thank you so much for the Global Peace and Prosperity Forum and Nida Salmanpour for the invitation and the opportunity to exchange our thoughts, representing here the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe, which I'm chairing since January 2020, which is an interesting period because it was something like an e-chair in the sense that with the pandemic, monitoring work, which lies in the heart of ECRI's work, really faced a number of obstacles, and we felt that as a monitoring body, we should do more than what we would do normally, had more public statements on events and what has been already mentioned by Nida, the George Floyd death and Black Lives Matter, as well as issues pertaining to frozen conflicts in the Council of Europe area, which I will refer to. And therefore, this discussion, which links racial justice, equity, and pathways to peace, lies very dear in our work and our hearts. So we are a preventive, non-judicial, specialized monitoring body, looking into what we call structural issues pertaining to racism. And when we say structural, is deep-rooted, institutional, systemic. Discrimination and intolerance in Greater Europe, from Portugal to the Russian Federation, from Norway to Turkey. In contrast, we don't deal with individual complaints, which is mostly handled by the European Court for Human Rights. So as a body, Nida, you already mentioned that we were set up in 1994, which means that we celebrated our 25th anniversary a year and a half ago. And it means that during this period, we have done 6 monitoring cycles of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. We are just now on our 6th cycle. Almost every 4 to 5 years, we do country reports, monitoring visions, where we take the pulse of racism and intolerance in each and every country, meeting both government representatives, seeing what happens on the ground and not just through legislation, because I have seen some remarks already on Q&A and chat box that legislation is not enough, and this is true. And also working together with equality bodies, national equality bodies, as well as with the civil society in general and NGOs, having confidential dialogues with the authorities and publishing country reports. Every 2 years after our monitoring visit, we also look whether our interim, most pressing recommendations have been met by authorities, and then we publish what we call conclusions. This is the first and most important, let's say, aspect of our work. And the second is what we call standard setting. So what happens through standard setting is we adopt general policy recommendations to governments, member states of the Council of Europe, where we gather our where we gather our experience from monitoring, for example, on anti-Roma hatred, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Semitism, racial profiling and police work, hate speech, undocumented migrants. So we have so far 16 general policy recommendations, and we have also started revising the ones we have adopted 15, 20 years ago. So we are currently revising 2 general policy recommendations on anti-Muslim hatred. Extremely interesting subject, especially in the face of terrorism, anti-Semitic violence, attacks, hate speech. And we will shortly begin a general policy recommendation on LGBTI rights, as we are a monitoring body also dealing since 2010 after a resolution by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe with LGBT rights. So we hopefully will soon start working on a general policy recommendation on LGBTI rights. And thirdly, we have contacts and annual seminars and panel discussions with national equality bodies and the civil society organizations, our key partners. We organize events throughout the years. So what have we observed in this ongoing, first of all, global health crisis, which is what has happened in the past year? I would like to mention certain worrying trends. So in several areas, we have seen that inequalities are deepening and that minority groups and migrants must be better protected against racism, discrimination, and intolerance, even more so when we have a number of crises occurring altogether. In our most recent annual report we published on the 18th of March 2021, we have revealed a mixed picture with examples of harmful practices or consequences of anti-COVID measures, as well as certain commendable initiatives, discrimination and racism. And this prompted us as ECRI to make a public statement, which we only do in extraordinary circumstances 1 year ago, where we called member states to take into account risks of intolerance and discrimination against minority groups and migrants in their structures and action in response to the pandemic. Earlier this month, on the basis of ECRI's work, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe adopted guidelines for governments to help them in upholding equality and protecting against discrimination and hate during this COVID-19 pandemic, but also similar crises in the future. As ECRI, we have also highlighted the new rise of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd, which, although originated in the US, quickly brought the debate about past and present wrongs to Europe as well. It sometimes acted as a wake-up call about what ECRI refers to as a long-standing and deep-rooted racism in public life, despite progress in certain areas. And we felt duty-bound to make another public statement in July 2020 on this matter, where we called member states to take further action to tackle racism in policing, including racial profiling, and more generally deep-rooted racism and racial discrimination in various areas of life. Trust in the police, building a culture in the police that is against this racial profiling, etc. As the Secretary General of the Council of Europe put it in a recently published annual report that was discussed this morning by European foreign ministers, cases of serious racist police abuse have served as catalysts for greater awareness of existing and more profound inequalities faced by certain communities, including in the fields of education, employment, housing, and health. In some countries, for instance, as the Secretary General underlined whilst referring to our work, that most Roma find themselves trapped in a vicious circle of undereducation leading to limited opportunities in the labor market and de facto residential segregation, which also has negative repercussions on their access to healthcare and other basic services. This may easily apply to other minorities or other minority groups in several European countries. Working together, living together, well-being together, one lesson to be drawn from these decades of combating racism and intolerance across Europe for ECRI, and more recently with the consequences of the coronavirus, is that whatever needs to be done, we cannot achieve alone. All actors must unite towards one goal, the building of racism-free and inclusive societies, more generally, a racism-free Europe and world. In this context, robust legal and policy frameworks must be established and developed. ECRI, together with CERD, which was already mentioned, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, and European Union FRA, Fundamental Rights Agency, clearly conveyed that message in our joint statement on the occasion of the International Anti-Racism Day last March. Building inclusive societies also means tackling racism and racial discrimination at their roots and paying increased attention to inclusive education. This is extremely important for ECRI, and that's why in our 6th monitoring cycle, we specifically discuss effective equality in education through education, as well as through independent, with enough resources and budget, equality bodies in each member state of the Council of Europe, as well as addressing hate speech and violence, also on the internet, which was already mentioned. And finally, integration and inclusion specifically, but not only for migrants, as well as Roma and other groups that still need integration, even if they are for centuries in a country, which is really a contradiction in terms. The Secretary General, in her recent report, we can discuss at length. She said whether racism and inequalities are a result of structural or institutional racism. However, the crucial point is the decisive action that must be taken. To achieve effective equality, European governments and societies must face up to their country's past, including the dark side of it in public discourse and in history teaching, especially in schools. As ECRI underlined, it is painful but a necessary exercise, and the media should play its share. Now, past and present injuries, and with this I finish, may at times be very difficult to heal. There are still today confrontations and unresolved conflicts in Europe. These confrontations and conflicts generate pain and hate and have been fed by pain and hate. Last month, we issued a statement on preventing and combating hate speech and violence in and around these so-called gray zones in Europe. It is essential for ECRI that all governments, including at the highest level, as well as other stakeholders, take their responsibilities and avoid adversarial narratives, counter hate speech, and put an end to hate-motivated violence. Governments should also act together with civil society, the media, and other relevant non-political actors, including equality bodies, and involve the youth to the greatest possible extent in the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies. That is the best way of turning to the future and to make peace with the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maruda, for that very insightful presentation. It's now my honor to introduce our next panelist, Professor Michael Penn, a dear friend and colleague of many years. Professor Penn is a clinical psychologist, department chair, and professor of psychology at Franklin and Marshall College in the United States. His research interests and publications explore the application of psychological research and theory to human rights, the interpretation of psychology and philosophy, and the relationship between culture and mental health. Professor Penn has lived and lectured widely around the world and served for many years the UN Leaders Program, which trains director-level United Nations officers. Professor Penn has also served the Federal University of Brazil and the government of Greenland in support of their efforts to reduce violence. In addition to numerous academic papers and chapters, he's the author and co-author of 4 books, including Our Common Humanity, Reflections on the Reclamation of the Human Spirit, currently in press. Professor Penn, the floor is yours.
It is a very high honor to be able to share a few thoughts on this distinguished panel. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think that perhaps my most important book, as you pointed out, Professor Agavan, is Our Common Humanity, Reflections on the Reclamation of the Human Spirit. And I think that it's an important contribution because my sense is that 500 years of engagement with racism has really clouded our understanding of who we are and where we could go together if we adopted the right perspective on human identity, on human relationships. And so what I try to do in that book is I try to give a rational account for what might be meant by the human spirit, but in a way that also respects the traditions of thinking and philosophy, the sacred traditions that have extended over thousands of years that try to describe to us the extraordinary capacities that animate the human spirit and that make it possible for us to liberate ourselves from both those biological impulses that make of us oftentimes savages in the presence of one another, as well as those historical forces that have imprisoned us in ways of thinking, in ways of being in the world that no longer work. The human spirit is that power that enables us to rise above these forces and to create something entirely new based upon an entirely fresh vision of human possibility. And so with your kind permission, I'll just say a few words about my understanding of the relevance of the human spirit in this discourse on pathways to peace. I was thinking, in fact, that was a very interesting title, Pathways to Peace, Racial Justice and Equity, Pathways to Peace. And I was thinking that any pathway to peace must necessarily pass through the city of the human heart. I think that much discourse on the problem of racial prejudice neglects the city of the human heart. You know, human beings are perhaps the most sensitive receptors in the universe. We are capable, of course, of detecting signals and signs from the natural world, which enable us to acquire an understanding of what is happening around us. But we also have this ability, we have these capacities to detect phenomena that are of moral or spiritual significance. In other words, we can detect, for example, the intention of a speaker, the motivation that animates the words that human beings share with one another. This sensibility is keenly in our minds and our understanding when we interact with children. We know that the tone of our voice, the content of our words, the cadence of our speech, all of these things have a tremendous influence on the hearer's ability to receive what it is that we are seeking to share. And I think that increasingly, as our language around the question of race, around the question of racism, around the question of prejudice, as our language becomes more and more in harmony with the kind of world that we want to live in, with the vision that we have for ourselves and for one another, we will be able to persuade more and more people that are on the periphery of this discourse to join in the discussion, because they feel like the discussion is going someplace, that we're making progress, that we're not saying the same thing in the same way over and over again, that our forms of discourse are becoming more refined, more elevating, more visionary. And I think that this is especially the case if we want to invite young people all over the world to participate as active agents of social change. You know, I am reminded of that extraordinary young girl. Her name is Emma Lazarus. You may remember Emma Lazarus. You know, when Emma Lazarus was 14 years old, she started to get the sense that she could make a contribution to the world. And she didn't know how she would do this, but she said, I am capable of writing. And so I will try to write sentences that will have an impact, I hope, on the future of humankind. Her family was among the first Jewish families to move into New York City. They moved into New York City in the late 1800s. And so she started to write in their beautiful house. They were a wealthy family. She started to write, hoping that she could persuade the American people to accept more refugees of Jewish background into the United States. And so she started to write these poems. She started to translate the writings of other extraordinary thinkers around the world. And she is that young lady that wrote that extraordinary poem, The New Colossus. You're probably familiar with that. It's that poem that appears on the base of the Statue of Liberty. She wrote that when she was a very, very young girl, but she was inspired by a vision of what we could be, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman, whose torch is the imprisoned lightning, her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. You remember that extraordinary poem. And that poem had actually a profound influence on the thinking of the American people. It opened a space in the heart of the American people to imagine receiving more people of Jewish background, notwithstanding the prejudice against the Jewish people. That poem inspired many Americans to open up their hearts to the possibility that we should invite more people of Jewish background into this American nation. The country has become, of course, 1,000 times enriched. And so the peoples of Europe are now faced with refugees, migrants, immigrants from all over the world, knocking at the door, saying, we have a contribution to make. Let us in, give us a voice, give us a place, and we shall make your nations better. We shall make your nations more beautiful. And I think that it is reasonable for us to consider the extraordinary influence that we could have if we spoke to the human spirit more deliberately, as we seek to persuade young people in particular to join in the struggle for racial justice. With your kind permission, I'll just say a few words about the human spirit and then close these brief remarks. I think of the human spirit as essentially consisting of three basic capacities. The capacity to know, which takes as its object truth about ourselves and truth about the world. You know, when we are seekers after truth, we are able to overcome prejudices, because prejudice is essentially an emotional commitment to a falsehood, to a false belief. And so if we are really seekers after truth, if we really encourage and develop in our young people, in our children, the longing to understand reality, the reality of the self and the reality of the world, if we can really get our educational institutions to generate not just people who know stuff, but people who are interested in pursuing knowledge of reality, knowledge of truth, that will actually begin to unite us. Because as we become more and more familiar with the truth about our histories, the truth about our capacities, the truth about our ancestors and the things that they both accomplished and the ways that they actually harmed humanity, as we learn these truths, we'll be able to liberate ourselves from the kinds of bigotries that come from sheer ignorance. The second capacity of the human spirit is the capacity to love, which takes as its object beauty, the beauty of an idea, the beauty of nature, the beauty of a way of life. The human heart has a natural attraction to beauty. We want to say beautiful things. We want to be around beautiful things. Beautiful ideas inspire us. You know, one of the reasons why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had such a profound influence was that it was so beautiful. And so I think that the cultivation of the discourse around race and racism in a way that recognizes the human heart's longing for beauty, the beauty and the diversity of the human community. You know, one philosopher who had been visiting this country, my country, the United States, in 1912, he was in a interracial gathering. And in that interracial gathering, it was one of the first times that Blacks and whites in the United States had actually come together in the same physical space. And he wanted to encourage the Blacks and whites who had come together in that physical space to open their hearts to one another. And this is one of the things that he said. He said, in the clustered jewels of the races, may the Blacks be as sapphires and rubies, and the whites as diamonds and pearls. The composite beauty of humanity will be witnessed in their unity and blending. And so he knew that if the American people could capture a vision of the beauty of their diversity, they could make of themselves something that would be an example to the rest of the world. So this second capacity of the human spirit to engage in the beauty of the world, to make beautiful things, to imagine beautiful futures, I think is also an important part of our effort. And then finally, the capacity of the human spirit to will. To will is to choose that which is good and best, that which is right, that which is honorable, that which we deserve because we have a consciousness of the inherent dignity of both ourselves and of other human beings. And I think that if we can mobilize human will around an idea whose time has come, the idea of the oneness and interdependence of all humankind, if we can inspire in the children, in the youth, and in people of all races and cultures and backgrounds, the conviction that if we pursue the realization of that truth, because it is a truth, who is that? Victor Hugo, who said, there is nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I think that the COVID situation, that the death of George Floyd in such a public way, all of these things remind us in a very poignant way that we have to make for ourselves a future that is more beautiful than what we have experienced in the past. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Penn, for your very thoughtful and inspiring words. With the permission of the panelists, I will now turn to some of the questions that the audience has given us. Some were submitted prior to the panel and others have been flowing in as you've been making your presentations. And perhaps, Ambassador Mohammed, I could begin with you following your very comprehensive presentation. Many things stood out. One of the themes that really stood out was when you referred to the visions of the founders of the African Union. And one just imagines how the world looked at that time in the very early stages of the decolonization process. In fact, when the United Nations had just begun to recognize the rights of peoples to self-determination in the famous Resolution 1514 of the General Assembly in 1960. So there is a question from one of the audience members, which I will, with your permission, read for you, and then perhaps solicit your comments. The question is, we know that in Europe, racism and nationalism grew together within the philosophical concept of civilization as early as the 13th century. According to the philosopher Todorov, eventually, civilization classified nations from the lowest or First Nations, who were the most dark-colored people, that were referred to as savages, quote unquote, not worthy of land acquisition, while the highest nations were the Western European nations or the white race. Eventually, nations could only consider ourselves and others. Now, many Euro-American people, either consciously or unconsciously, consider themselves as superior to all world nations, using categorical words like developed and underdeveloped or third world. My question is, why only concentrate on racial justice and equity? Why not concentrate simply on justice and equity for all, no matter what creed, color, or cultural differences, as pathways to peace? And that question is from Gabby Marguerite Pelletier. Would you care to share your thoughts, Ambassador Mohammed?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that that question. It's quite a loaded one, and quite difficult to respond to, particularly from an institutional perspective, because it's our responsibility as institutions is to ensure that policies are in place. And I try to elaborate, from a broad perspective, what actually, exists in terms of global and regional policies from the African perspective. But I also try to highlight the fact that there is a responsibility that we have as individuals, as countries and nationals, and even organizations and institutions, where we need to draw out and define and domesticate where domestication is needed in order to implement some of these policies. We have the broader frameworks that exist, but at the end of the day, definitions have to be clarified and adapted to many of the realities. So I don't think it's necessarily adapted to just racism in terms of differences in race, but it's broader in terms of discrimination, and discrimination can be, all types of discrimination. I also earlier tried to talk about a little bit about what we have tried to do, from the African perspective in terms of domestication. And I'm not sure if I mentioned the African Charter on Humans and People's Rights, which is also known as the Banjul Charter. And this is basically an international human rights instrument that is in the broad sense intended to promote and protect human rights and basic freedoms in the broad sense. Now, members to this charter have a responsibility, and each of us individually also has a responsibility to advocate and to work towards ensuring that what we signed up to in terms of the charter are respected. It's very broad. For example, it has a number of norms which are included, such as civil and political rights, economic, social, civil rights, in the broad sense. And at the end of the day, it's about adaptation. People, I think, fundamentally, and I think, Professor Michael elaborated on this very eloquently in terms of interpretation and how we perceive and how we choose to define what discrimination means to us, and how, at the end of the day, it boils down to the individual, right, and our own kind of perceptions. For example, the charter that I refer to is guided, for example, by a principle that it should reflect the conception of human rights and a philosophy that meets the needs for us as Africans, and kind of recognizing the responsibility of international human rights broadly. But there was a need to kind of combine the various values of African cultures and standards and recognize what is universally valid. And of course, we have institutions that are there to kind of monitor its implementation. So I can only speak, from that perspective. At the end of the day, it's about individual responsibility. No matter how others choose to define what they feel the standards are and who should be above others, that is on them. At the end of the day, we're the ones that have the responsibility to do the advocacy. There is a need for policy, but policy also has to be translated into action. It has to be implemented. There may be a lot of criticism aimed at global, regional, and national policies, which principally stems from adaptation and implementation. And there are flaws, but flaws can be corrected through reforms. They can be pushed through advocacy, particularly for those that it affects, because at the end of the day, we know where it pinches and where it hurts when we're faced with some of these realities. And then most importantly, I think we need to be able to allocate the resources to make the changes for effective implementation. Not just have talk shops, but allocating resources in terms of time and material resources is fundamental in order for us to be able to achieve what we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed, for that very thoughtful response. And following your emphasis on individual responsibility, I would like now to turn to Professor Maruda. And there is a question from the audience, which I will put to you, and perhaps one of my own to supplement it. The question is, can universities, in collaboration with NGOs, play a vital role to bring equality and social harmony in the area of racial justice? And perhaps following on what Ambassador Mohammed has said about individual responsibility, this relates more to the responsibility of civil society. And Professor Maruda, you're a professor of law, as am I, and it's interesting for us to think beyond the law. To what extent should we be thinking in terms of individual and social responsibility, which is not necessarily dictated by laws and institutions, but by our own choices? Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. A tough question. It's true that even the role of universities has changed. enormously. Even law faculties tend to become different in this way and more open to changes and to listening more to society, and not just working with repression or repressive attitudes and structures. And I know very well your writings and your work on international criminal law, which is mostly relevant for repression, but we have seen, and this is also something that we have seen as a monitoring body, that prevention, working with education, working with the youth, these inspired words by Professor Penn were extremely interesting in that respect. So working preventively is extremely important. So how to do that? More specifically, we have seen that we have to measure to open the dialogue on racism and intolerance also in the universities, in the classroom, in schools. Most of the times, most of the surveys say different things than what we initially think. So only by opening the dialogue and really discussing biases, stereotypes, for example, linking education and labor through the stage that every university offers and works with is one way of addressing inequalities. Because if you don't have a stage for everyone, then it means that access to labor is completely different. Opportunities are completely different. And therefore, having awareness campaigns in universities, having relevant courses discussing these developments, discussing how to link civil society and the university, teaching, working, volunteering in different NGOs changes completely the perspectives. However, this is not enough. We still need to make sure that university professors have the training to be able to follow all the time developments, what is happening actually in the world. We need to have contacts with different bodies. We need to have what we call independent and efficient equality bodies, the ombudspersons, human rights committees. They need to have budget and staff. And this is something we never discuss. So what we have done as ECRI is that we asked these equality bodies not only to wait for complaints to come to them, but to themselves work together with universities for different researches, to organize themselves awareness campaigns, to be known, better known. So links between university and equality bodies are extremely important in the sphere of prevention. And of course, it's also a matter of modernizing the curricula in the universities and changing completely the way we teach. We need to make the link between reality and what is being taught in the universities even more.
Thank you very much, Professor Maruda, and there's much to discuss in some of the themes that you've touched on, an issue which is very much alive, certainly in universities here in Canada. I'm now going to turn to Professor Penn with two related questions. I will read both of them, even though they overlap to a certain extent, and they're particularly thoughtful questions. One of them is from Christine Muller. And the question is, critical race theory is currently widely promoted among people who sincerely seek to work for racial justice. And this follows what Professor Maruda said about the changing complexion of the academy, intellectual complexion of the academy. So critical race theory, however, this theory seems to aggravate the racial divisions as it divides all people into oppressors and oppressed, and labels everyone who does not subscribe to this theory as racist. How can we engage in a constructive dialogue with such groups? A very thought-provoking and provocative question. And I'm going to read a second related question which was submitted prior to the panel. And that question is, people fighting for justice and equality have to deal with individuals, groups, or institutions who are seen as oppressive, unjust, or corrupt. Fighting for justice, however, is also often seen as being aggressive, which usually provokes and intensifies confrontation. How do we challenge injustice to promote social change while avoiding polarizing confrontation that intensifies hatred and division between people? And that question is from Sophia Newton. So two very provocative questions. Professor Penn.
Thank you so much. Those are quite interesting and provocative, both of those questions. You know, I think that in the most general sense, what I have been trying to share has to do with reconceptualizations of power. You know, we have a lot of experience with exercising power, and we have to mature in our exercise of power. We have to broaden the scope of our understanding of what it means to exercise power. Let me just give you an example. Let's say a word about power in the most general sense. You know, there are constructive powers which enable us to build something. And when we can build something in cooperation with others, the thing that we can build is far more complex than the kind of thing that we can build by ourselves. So constructive powers require information and energy. And the more complex the vision is for building, the more information, the more knowledge, the more wisdom is necessary in order to build it. So what you want to do is you want to create communities of people who are able to have discourse with one another in higher and higher degrees of refinement over time. And in this way, they can bring into being a vision that is more extraordinary than any vision could be brought in by, say, the whites or the Europeans or the blacks. So if we're pursuing the prosperity of humankind, what we want to do is we want to exercise power in our discourse with others in such a manner as to empower others to engage with us. That's like the ideal situation, right? We want to use power in such a way as to empower others to use their power in relationship to us. And sometimes this requires that we exercise forms of power that are largely neglected in our society. I'll give you an example. I think that one of the most extraordinary powers that human beings have access to is the power of humility. Humility makes a space for other people to offer observations without your critical judgment of their contribution. So in effect, what you do is you hold yourself back, realizing that you don't know everything, and you want to make a space for other voices to appear, recognizing that some of those voices have been very hurt by history, very disturbed, battered, abused, mistreated. And so sometimes those voices will sound to us maybe even a little aggressive. But because we are taking a humble posture in relationship to those who have been harmed, who have been hurt, we don't so aggressively respond to their voice with more aggression on our side. So we're not engaged in this sort of disputational, aggressive interaction. We are creating a posture in which many different kinds of voices can be brought to the table until we learn how to engage in discourse that is more and more profitable. So that's one element, I think, of the question of, for example, critical race theory. You know, critical race theory, I think, makes a contribution to the discourse. It's not the only contribution. It makes a contribution. It asks us to think critically about our racialized ideas. I live in the land of race relations. What do I mean by that? It's impossible to have a relationship in the United States between people that are Black and white without race being the most salient variable. Wherever I go, the most significant variable is usually race, usually some physical distinction between people. And this reality of race relations makes it very difficult for us to hear anything that's not overly racialized or to even speak in ways that are not overly racialized. So we're trying to learn together in the 21st century new forms of discourse, new ways of engaging others who are different, which then give us access to their humanity beyond their racial address. And I think that to achieve success in that regard is not easy to do. And I think that we are just saying to one another in these years, boy, this is difficult work, but we should have patience with one another, and we should have confidence that we will make progress if we continue to nourish the right kinds of intentions and not be overly critical of one another as we strive to do these kinds of things.
Thank you, Professor Penn, for your thoughtful response. In the time that remains, I have maybe time for 2 more questions, and then maybe we can wrap up. So I will turn once again to Professor Maruda. And as a fellow law professor, I'm drawing you further and further away from international law. I hope you don't object. But we have a question, a very wonderful question from Arthur Dahl. What can be done to lay a foundation of appreciation of racial diversity among children and pre-adolescents to protect them against racist attitudes later? Would you care to share your observations on that question? Thank you.
I thank you, and indeed, this might seem as a far away from international law question, but it's not really. What we have seen through the different surveys on biases that exist even at preschool, at primary, before primary school, at preschool level, this is where you have really to have the most successful or the biggest failures when it comes to successful inclusion in schools. So if you work at the age of 3 to 5 and you offer at this stage children access to preschools, because already this is not the case in a number of states, then you most probably can change the narratives. You can make sure that everybody is included or feels secure at schools afterwards. And there is no school dropout, which is a huge issue. So first of all, to make sure you have children ready is to be there and have a curricula that makes them feel and not just learn. So this is something so difficult, especially after a year of distance learning, where we cannot relate anymore to any feelings sometimes. Therefore, you have to work with different ways at early stages, and then make sure that you have a lot of narratives, you have a lot of history. Storytelling is very successful rather than human rights education, I'm afraid, or civic education. At least this is what we see when we monitor school classrooms, environments, and we know what are the areas, especially areas where you have migration background of most children, what works. So initiatives in different schools, best practices, promising practices is how you can work. And this we make sure in each and every of our reports. We manage to also highlight good examples, promising examples, or concerning situations. For example, I will never forget a director, a principal, a school principal who had to face children at the age of 16 in Denmark that didn't want to be together with Muslim adolescents because they wouldn't party. It can be as simple as that, and at the same time as frightening as that. So you really have to work before on changing narratives rather than having school segregation, which is what most of the times principals would do for social cohesion. And this is wrong, and we know it, and we have seen it.
Thank you very much, Professor Maruda. And it's humbling to realize that events of global and historical significance begin with child rearing, with very early developmental phases. But that's also a source of hope and inspiration that one can affect profound generational change. And I also appreciate greatly your reference to empathy, an emotional connection, something which may be among the changes in the epistemological traditions, the assumptions we have about knowledge, referring back to your own idea about the role of the university and the production of knowledge. I'm now going to turn to Professor Penn for one final question, and then unfortunately, I think we will have to wrap up. So the question is from Cheryl Peakball, and it says, please comment on the value of a more accurate, less Eurocentric version of global world history being taught to children and youth in eradicating false notions of the inherent superiority of one race over another. I think it flows very well from the previous question to Professor Maruda. Professor Penn.
Yes, yes. I think that of all of my concerns with the country that I live in, the greatest is, I think, the failure of our educational system. You know, our educational system is producing the kinds of outcomes that we see in politics, in our approach to governance, in our inability to resolve even the most simple social and political challenges. So our educational systems are not preparing our minds to solve the kinds of problems that we have before us. Educational systems have to help us to become the kinds of people that the world needs in order to solve the problems that it has. And I think that if educational systems are going to do this, they'll have to integrate two different approaches to knowledge, two different approaches to learning. You know, one approach to learning I call the academic scholastic tradition of learning. It has to do with gaining knowledge of the natural world, of the laws and principles that govern the operation of the natural world, so that we can live in the natural world more effectively while also meeting our basic physical needs. The second tradition of learning is what I would call the wisdom enlightenment tradition. The wisdom enlightenment tradition of learning has to do with learning about ourselves, self-mastery, self-knowledge, developing the capacity to become human beings that are realizing more and more of our humanity. You know, if we could say what the purpose of life seems to be, it seems to be development. And for human beings, the development that we are pursuing is the development of our own humanity. And so I think that as educational institutions integrate these two forms of learning, they'll begin to produce people that are capable both of making a contribution to the needs of the world, while also being the kinds of people that can cooperate and work together with others, and that will have, you know, the qualities of character that are so desperately needed everywhere. And I think that it is my hope that we will experiment more and more, both at the elementary school level and at the university level, with integrating these two epistemic systems, these two forms of knowledge.
Thank you very much, Professor Penn. We have just about 5 minutes, and I wanted to abuse my privilege as chair to put a very simple question to our distinguished panelists for just a very brief response. And getting back to some of the questions about divisive approaches towards confronting racism, and how we could imagine a unifying approach which is focused on a shared humanity. How can we begin to speak about the effects of racism on the perpetrators of racism? Just as, for example, in the context of equality between men and women, we would look at the harm that is self-inflicted harm on men of oppressing women. How could we change the conversation by bringing in such a dynamic? Professor Maruda.
That's a million-dollar question, right? What we have seen is, first of all, we have to stop talking among ourselves. The believers, the ones that we share this common vision, the ones that are against racism, always talk among each other, which is wrong. And everybody else has been labeled as racist, which is also wrong. So we have to really try to see what makes people alone, lonely, makes them feel they want to be part of a group, even if this group is a fanatic, totalitarian, extremist, etc., etc. It's a failure of our society if we are unable to really discuss loneliness at this stage. And therefore, addressing divisive speech, dialogue, hate speech means, first of all, we have to try to understand what is happening and what is making people or groups so hateful, especially on the net, on the internet. And at the same time, making sure that we are respectful of the freedom of expression, which we kind of have lost. We need to balance it all the way. And indeed, try to understand complexity in these divisive discussions. So coming back to what you said earlier, for example, racialization in religion is something that we see. We have to address it. When we are talking about anti-Semitism and then its actions of Israel that come to play, you have to discuss it. When we are talking about anti-Muslim hatred and then suddenly terrorism comes into play, you have to discuss it, you have to address it. If this means that it's not about religion anymore, you really have to acknowledge it. And then you move to try to understand better differences and different approaches.
Thank you, Professor Maruda. Professor Penn, final observations.
You know, one of the scariest moments of my life occurred not too long ago when I was invited to address the Kansas City Police Academy. And I had been invited to address the Kansas City Police Academy when just down the street there were protests going on associated with police brutality. When I walked into the room, there were literally hundreds of police officers dressed in blue, and about 95% of them were white. And my physical presence in that room created a kind of tension that I cannot even describe to you. As I walked down the aisle to take my place in the auditorium, you could feel the tension. And I thought to myself, is there anything at all that connects me with these young men who are trying to serve as police officers? And it occurred to me that my brother was a police officer. My brother Tony was a police officer in New York City. And while he was serving as a police officer in New York City, his partner was killed in front of him. And so my brother developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And just thinking, this is the only connection that I can feel in my heart to these police officers. And so I'll begin my remarks by sharing the story of my brother. And when I shared the story of my brother, what it did was it opened a little space for them to receive me as someone who was somehow connected to them. And in that little space, we began to have a conversation about what happens when African-American men who have been greatly traumatized meet police officers who have been greatly traumatized on a street in Kansas, in New York City, in Baltimore. What is happening in their nervous system? What is happening in their hearts? Why do these encounters turn out so badly? And I found remarkably receptivity to these ideas. They wanted to learn about this, but I had to talk in such a way, I had to approach it in such a way as to render us vulnerable to one another's story, to one another's history, to one another's background. And I think that that is part of the part of the key to the future is trying to figure out how to be in such a way as to bring out the absolute best in others, even if the absolute best is just a little bit to work with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that very remarkable story. And last but not least, I will turn to Ambassador Mohammed with just one perhaps final question. We are reflecting here on the impact of racism, not just on its victims, but on its perpetrators. And I'm reminded of Jean-Paul Sartre's famous statement that the Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. And one could obviously replace that with racism and a whole set of other hateful prejudices that are unfortunately on display in the world. So do you have any final thoughts to share on how we can move the discourse, the anti-racism discourse, to one which focuses on a shared humanity, including the benefits to perpetrators of these attitudes, for a sort of mutual liberation? Any thoughts you care to share, Ambassador?
Oh, thank you. That was quite a profound, I think, quote, and can definitely be adapted to many of our contexts. But I think it does boil down to the issue of our shared humanity and the understanding of it. It boils down to awareness raising, to advocacy, to accountability, and we all, at the end of the day, need to be able to play our part and take responsibility for both our actions and in our inaction, as the case may be. But we also have to believe in our institutions and be able to hold them accountable as well. So our individual responsibility, but also the responsibility of the institutions and frameworks and what we've signed up to, both as individuals, as countries, and the responsibilities that are given to us. I think, at the end of the day, we do have a lot of work to do, but we have to keep pushing for equality and for equity in order to push for a true, I think, or let me just say a balanced world in this global community of ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed, and it's very reassuring to know that the AU has such an eloquent and astute spokesperson, representative at the United Nations. Thank you for your efforts, also to Professor Maruda and Professor Penn. I'm sure the audience agrees that we could have spoken for much longer, but I will just perhaps reflect briefly in conclusion on the theme of empathy, which emerged, including in the comments of Professors Maruda and Professor Penn, the simple capacity to feel the pain of others. And one wonders how many wounds would be healed in this world if we could simply put ourselves in the shoes of those in this world who suffer from injustice. So with your permission, I will share from my own tradition of the Persian civilization, the poem of Saadi from the city of Shiraz from the 13th century. And this poem appears outside the portal of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And Saadi wrote 700-800 years ago, human beings are members of a whole, created in essence of one soul. Should fate afflict one part with pain, the other parts uneasy will remain. You who have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So perhaps we can revive this ancient wisdom which exists in all of our cultures, all of our civilizations, and begin to transform our inextricably interdependent world and achieve the vision that we have so long had of a unified world civilization founded on recognition of human dignity. With those thoughts, I wish to once again thank very much Ambassador Mohammed, Professor Maruda, Professor Penn, for taking time out of your busy schedules. I thank also Baroness Scotland for her video recorded testimony. And most of all, I thank very much Neda Salmanpour and the Center for Global Peace and Prosperity for having assembled such an outstanding panel. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.